Welcome to Church in the Time of the Virus, Episode 7, the episode in which I don't make any other Star Wars jokes. I've been trying to find examples from church history on what happens to church meetings during a time of the plague, and I'm not finding much. This episode will cover examples that I've found. I suspect they probably capture the general response of other examples I'm missing. So, disclaimer first of all, I'm a little worried that my sense of what we should be doing will distort how I process these examples. I hope it doesn't, but I want you to be aware that I'm aware of my tendency toward confirmation bias. I welcome thoughtful and kind discussion to set me on the right path if you think it's needed. So, number one, in the Old Testament, which I know is not the church, but since the Israelites were God's people, it's at least in the same ballpark. You couldn't go out and about in the community or oot and a boot, as some of us say up here, if you were sick or unclean. Leviticus 13:46 says, as long as they have the disease, they remain unclean. They must live alone and they must live outside the camp. That would certainly mean that they could not engage in corporate worship in the tabernacle or temple with the others. I think that's noteworthy because the Israelite community was centered around that kind of gathering. When someone was a danger to others in terms of spreading disease, it was better that they not participate in what was considered a crucial part of communal and spiritual life. Number two, during the time of the early church, think 1st and 2nd century. I'm not aware that Rome canceled church meetings during the plague. It was kind of already illegal after all, so I assume the church kept on meeting. However, because of their front line in the plague, in some ways they were our equivalent of first responders or medical personnel. Their local assembly seems to have been populated with like-minded Christ followers who stoically and faithfully assumed that sickness and perhaps even death was inevitable in their dual roles as medical personnel and church parishioners. This puts them in a very different place than where we are, but I'm not sure how different. Perhaps if all of a small local congregation now worked in a COVID-19 ward, that all the other medical personnel had deserted, and then they all met together in a hospital chapel, stoically accepting an assumed fate, maybe that would be a better comparison, but that's not what's happening, so I'm not quite sure what to do with that. Fast forward, during the Black Death in the 1300s, Luther thought the church should keep meeting in his city, but I'm also not aware that he was defying a governmental order to stay open. Luther also seems convinced there's a spiritual force behind the plague. I get a sense from his famous letter that he saw coming to church as a form of spiritual warfare against a biological disease that had a supernatural and even satanic force behind it. From an article called Plagues Bring Fear and Isolation, but Church History Shows There Are Remedies at catholicherald.co.uk, I got some information about the Plague of Milan in the 1500s. So at that time, churches were closed, and St. Charles became famous. Here's some things he did while churches were closed. He had altars set up on the streets so people could see Mass celebrated from their windows. Small groups of magistrates and religious orders would walk through the streets so people could see that their officials and clergy had not fled. He practiced social distancing, putting up a grill so that those consulting him would not become infected if he were weak. Those who gave communion to the sick were told to hold their fingers in a candle flame immediately afterwards. Priests heard confessions through closed doors, holding a stick to measure the distance they should stay behind the threshold. Booklets were distributed with prayers to use at certain times of day when the cathedral bells would be rung so everyone knew they were praying together. In 1854, there was a cholera outbreak in London. Charles Spurgeon was a young pastor at the time. The neighborhood where Spurgeon's church met was not quarantined, and I don't believe churches were told to stop meeting, so we don't have a record of what Spurgeon would have recommended for church life if that were the case. We do have a record of the way he ministered, but not about the issue that we're talking about here today. From the article, How D.C. Churches Responded When the Government Banned Public Gatherings During the Spanish Flu of 1918, and I got this from a website called 9marks.org. D.C. churches responded to a ban on public gatherings by voting unanimously to agree with the decree. The pastors released the following statement, which I've edited somewhat. Resolved in view of the prevailing condition of our city, that is, the widespread prevalence of influenza that has called forth the request from the District of Columbia commissioners, we do place ourselves on record as cheerfully complying with the request of the commissioners, which we understand applies to all churches alike. There was at least 130 African American churches that also abandoned their services. And although responses to this order was mixed, churches demonstrated a unified response. One Presbyterian church explained their cancellation of services in the following way: "Inasmuch as it has seemed wise to the commissioners of the district to prohibit the gathering of people on Sunday in their accustomed places of worship, may I suggest that at the usual hour of morning service you gather in your homes and unite in common prayer to the God of nations and of families, that he will guide us in all wisdom in this time of trial, that our physicians and public officers may be led in their performance of duty and be strengthened by divine help, that the people may be wise and courageous, each in his place. Let us never forget that help comes from the Lord who made heaven and earth. Behold, he that keeps Israel shall neither slumber nor sleep." So here's my takeaway on corporate meetings. The Israelites practiced the quarantine of sick people even when it interfered with the rituals in the tabernacle or the temple. It was seen as prudent, not cowardly. I'm not aware of churches defying a governmental order to close in the time of the plague. I don't know what Spurgeon and Luther would have done about church services had the state told them to close. But when churches did close, they found ways to continue to minister as safely as possible. Thanks to technology, we don't have to march through the street or hold a stick between each other, but we can march through social media and keep a bandwidth between each other. The church's response in 1918 was widespread and consistent. They experimented with outdoor services, which eventually got canceled as well. And then they pushed hard to restart services, and they did as soon as they could. So where does that leave us? Well, I think first of all, it leaves us with room for personal disagreement about what we should do when it comes to meeting in the time of the plague. As best I could tell, the weight of the history of God's people leans toward, number one, honoring our governmental authorities when they demand closing. Number two, doing what we can to follow solid medical advice in times of deadly contagion. And three, longing and planning to reconvene. I think Christians today have two fears. Maybe it's just me, because I know I have these. First, I fear that if I cancel services to honor the state or simply in response to community pleading, history will view me as a coward, bailing on the demands of the faith out of fear of disease or judgment from the culture. But second, I fear that if I don't cancel when the state demands it or in response to community pleading, history will view me as a killer, sacrificing the safety of others to assuage my conscience or my fear of judgment from others in the church. It's called a rock and a hard place. So what do? Here's where my conscience places me, and you before God need to decide where your conscience places you. We honor our authorities through obedience, and we close our corporate gatherings. We love our neighbor by social distancing, as well as by preparing to be radically generous as need arises, and by knowing that if and when we must walk toward the sick and into the pandemic as part of our job or our ministry as Christians, we do so with faith, not fear. Meanwhile, we pray for the health of all and for wisdom as we navigate this together. And we pray that God's grace uses tensions, such as the question of meeting or not meeting, as a means of building maturity within the church and in us for our good and for God's glory.